Well, hi, everyone. I recently had a chance to talk with Aaron Renn, who's just very thoughtful, person who has a great background in business and consulting and understanding how to find solutions to problems for businesses, but now has kind of turned some of his work towards his faith and the view of Christianity and the world around us. But we didn't just stop there. We kind of got into some other areas about what that means for our neighborhoods, for our communities, for our societies, where institutions and faith organizations that we maybe grew up with or counted on or relied on in the past are viewed very differently today. And what are the implications of that? And that might help us understand maybe why we look past or look back to the good old days and sometimes wonder how to connect where we are. So we had a great discussion, incredibly insightful a person, really nice guy, even though he went to Indiana University and I'm a Purdue guy. We had a little fun with that, but I think you're going to enjoy his insights and the conversation very much.
We believe and have always believed in this country that man was created in the image of God, that he was given talents and responsibilities and was instructed to use them to make this world a better place in which to live. And you see, this is the really great thing of America.
It's time to discover what binds us together, and finding it has the power to transform our world. That's what I believe. How about you? Aaron, thanks so much. We're honored to have you here and to be able to chat a little bit with you, your background as a writer, and really your insights in society and things of that nature that you have. It'll be fun to have a chance to chat through some of these things.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got to make sure we let everybody know that AaronRenn.com is where a lot of your thoughts reside, I would assume, right?
I try everything that I write makes its way there.
Okay.
So that's where you sign up to get everything.
Okay. AaronRenn.com.
That's right.
All right. All righty. Good deal. Well, we got to make sure that everybody knows where to go because we're going to wander through a lot of different topics here in this conversation. And maybe the first one we had just started with was I'm a Purdue guy. You're an Indiana University person. Big rivals, but I think we're going to be okay.
We'll see. We'll see.
Okay. Well, it's not football season yet or basketball season, so this is a good time of peace amongst rivalries in the world around us, right?
Let's hope.
Let's hope. Well, let's hope there's some good fun stuff too as we go. My father-in-law is also an IU grad, so when we lose the Oak and Bucket, I tend to come home and see a lot of IU stuff around the house from time to time. So hopefully it doesn't happen that often.
But, we shall see.
That's how it goes.
I'm hoping we turn up the volume on our football program a little bit.
There you go. Yeah. Well, everyone's trying to do that.
Right.
That's for sure. But that's not what we're here to talk about. What we're here to talk about is really your insights and your perspectives on the world around us, and primarily we'll start with, but we can go to other areas, primarily where faith, and more specifically Christianity, is placed or is viewed in the world today, and then how, as we do on this podcast all the time, how can we think about things wherever our faith journey is leading us, connect in our culture today or in our society today, or express our views in a way that that allows the views to be heard or at least discussed, maybe. And so a lot of your writing starts to talk about the environment that we're in, specifically from a faith perspective. But we can go to some, and as we go, I'd like to go to some other areas I'd like to talk about Grand Rapids. You're here in Grand Rapids with us, which is great. I'd like to talk about, just maybe not necessarily politics in general, but how we think about public policy and potentially, prosperity, things of that nature. But let's start with faith, because that was the one I think that frames out the most how we should think about the world that we're dealing with, and it may not be the one we grew up in. And you've kind of
No, it's
grouped it
not.
into, where Christianity was viewed positively, neutral, and now in today's world, negative. Can you walk us through that framework and give us an idea as we start here about how you would describe and how you're seeing the culture, the environment in which we're living?
Absolutely. I'm probably best known for my 3 worlds of evangelicalism framework, although it's not limited to evangelicalism. It would apply to any form of Christianity in America.
Right.
And I think our professional lens that we come to life with shapes so much about how we see the world. And so my first job out of college was as a management consultant.
Right.
And I spent about 15 years in the
Fascinating
consulting
history
industry.
to what brought you here. Keep going.
And that gives you a way of thinking about the world and a set of tools that you use to make sense of the world. So one of the things we do is we collect a lot of data, and then we create frameworks that help clients understand what's going on in the business world or understand the options that they have. And so this is sort of a consulting framework that I used to describe changes in American culture and its relationship to Christianity over the last 60 years or so. Okay. So if you go back to the 1950s, there was still sort of a softly institutionalized Protestant establishment in America. That was the high watermark of church attendance. About 50% of all adults attended church each week. And Christianity sort of had normative force in America. And starting in the 60s, the mid-60s, I actually date it to the Kennedy assassination. I mean, not that that had anything to do with it, but it seems to be that's when the world started going crazy. It was right around that time. So right around 63, 64, the status of Christianity in America began to go into decline. So we saw a decline in church attendance. We saw that Christian morality came under question in the counterculture and in the sexual revolution. We saw that the old Protestant establishment, Protestant consensus sort of broke up in America. And we've been dealing with
what do you mean by that Protestant consensus?
So if you think about America, it was historically overwhelmingly Protestant. So when the country was founded, America was 98% Protestant. Okay. I think there were 25,000 Catholics in the country. And America really was a sort of Protestant or Anglo-Protestant centered nation for a very long time. And we had this thing they called the establishment, or the WASP establishment, after the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And the WASPs were essentially the American upper class. And you can think of, the Addams family, people like that, Roosevelts, essentially people who had come from prestigious and wealthy families sort of dominated American life up through about the 1950s. And even into the 1950s, if you were Jewish, you would be blackballed from country clubs. If you were Catholic, you might also find yourself socially excluded or socially marginalized. Although by that era, as sort of the Ellis Island immigrants had come into the country and started assimilating and climbing the economic ladder, that was starting already to break down. A Jewish thinker named Will Herberg wrote a famous book called Protestant Catholic Jew, and it was sort of about this idea of what they called the triple melting pot. That there were sort of very similarities, but sort of Catholics were still sort of marrying Catholics. Different Protestants were still marrying each other. And even within Protestantism, maybe a Presbyterian and a Lutheran wouldn't marry each other. And so it was still I would say still sort of I wouldn't call it formally institutionalized, but softly institutionalized sort of Protestantism in the United States. You see this a little bit in the fact that the Episcopal Cathedral in Washington, D.C., National Cathedral, is sort of the state funeral place where, when a dead bury a president, you go there. There's a lot of that stuff. Of course, a lot of the upper class people were Episcopalian, Presbyterian, things of that nature. And so that was sort of American religiosity up to that point in that thing. And of course, it was a big deal that Kennedy was the first Catholic elected president in 1960. That shows that starting to break down.
Right.
But it was people were suspicious of that. Is this going to do what the Pope tells him? That sort of thing.
Sure.
So there was this sort of religious background, and that's one reason that I think the era before the 50s needs to be understood in a sort of its own frameworks. It takes that. My three worlds framework is the time since the 50s, since like 64, when Christianity's gone into decline, especially the mainline denominations have really gone into decline. And it's kind of been declining since then.
Right.
And not all, maybe in a straight line or at the exact same pace, but sort of like the stock market zigs and zags a little bit, but the trend is still going on.
Right.
And so basically I take this period between, say, 1964 and today, and I divide it into three phases that I call the positive, the neutral, and the negative world. And these titles refer to the way the secular society kind of views Christianity. In the positive world, which lasts from 64 to 94, Christianity is in decline. I want to be clear about that.
Okay.
Things are not going great for Christianity, but at the same time, it's still basically viewed positively by society. To be known as a good church-going man made you seem like an upstanding member of society, and Christian moral norms sort of had still the norms of society, and if you violated them, you could get in trouble.
Yep.
And the example I like to use there is 1987, when Colorado Senator Gary Hart, there was this report that he'd had a young woman stay all night in his townhouse in Washington, D.C. He had to drop out of the presidential campaign over that. Today,
wasn't he on a boat in Miami with monkey business?
The monkey business and all that stuff.
I remember that part too. Yes.
Yeah, there was a lot going on there.
Yes,
but,
yes.
But this idea that if you had an affair, you were simply disqualified from running. Of course, that's a completely different scenario today.
Right.
Then around 1994, we hit a tipping point where we entered what I call the neutral world, which I have a list extending from 94 to 2014, in which Christianity is no longer viewed positively, but it's not really viewed negatively either. It's sort of one more lifestyle choice among any in a pluralistic public square.
Okay.
So I might sit down with you like this, and I say, "Well, I'm a Christian." You'd say, "Great, I'm a vegan.
Yeah.
Let's talk. Let's have a conversation." And again, we could think maybe of the Monica Lewinsky scandal as being the negative world, where it was still badly damaging to Bill Clinton, but he sort of survived it. And people started to, it's his private life. But we deplore what he did. There's still this idea of it's terrible, but it was his private life. It wasn't his public life. So you already see things changing there. And then in 2014, we had a sort of a second tipping point, where in the first time in the 400-year history of America, kind of elite society, mainstream culture views Christianity negatively. To be known as sort of a Bible-believing Christian is a status negative. It doesn't help you get a job at Google or Goldman Sachs. Quite the opposite, in fact. Christian morality here is expressly rejected, and in fact is even viewed maybe as the leading threat to the new sort of morality, the new public moral order. An example I maybe use here is the Access Hollywood tape scandal in 2016 when Donald Trump was running for president. It was basically, in retrospect, a 48-hour blip of a scandal. All of Donald Trump's, moral and sexual indiscretions basically just bounced off him because it's hard for people to hold him accountable to standards that society itself has rejected.
Right.
They're trying to you evangelicals, you need to reject Trump just like you did Clinton, but the world changed and it didn't work. And I think that shows that the implications of this negative world are actually pervasive and maybe show up in areas we don't think. I don't see a guy like Donald Trump getting elected president in those previous eras, but in a negative world where sort of the moral frameworks that previously governed this society are essentially delegitimized, a guy like Donald Trump is just one more guy, living his best life now, if you will. So that's sort of the framework that I laid out. And I see that, again, American Christianity, and I focus a lot on evangelicals, have struggled to find a way to adapt to this negative world. And you probably see a lot about these intra-evangelical battles between people who support Trump, like, say, Eric Metaxas on the one hand, the radio guy, and David French, or people like that on the other. And there's very acrimonious disputes with sort of an evangelicalism, which I see as a result of sort of this new negative world and the pressures of it starting to bear down on people who happen to have sort of different dispositions and different strategies and different ways to think about the world, and it's causing them to sort of crack up in a sense.
And become divided.
And become very divided. And, as I say, it used to be in the 90s, they talked about the culture war,
Right.
Sort of the evangelicals and conservative Catholics fighting this culture war against the culture. But now there's a culture war, but the culture war is internal to evangelicalism itself.
Okay. Well, that's a couple thoughts. So that's in the history of the world. It's not the first time Christianity has been viewed negatively.
Right.
It kind of started out that way, but it's the first time in our country. And for those of us who, as you say, who are living in that, so if I look at my life, it's really easy to think I'm still in the previous world.
Right.
And then I wonder why what I'm saying or what I'm doing doesn't resonate, doesn't connect, or even turns people off from a life that I thought was well regarded, as you said. And so, talk a little bit about the implications of that, and why it's so important, maybe for us to understand the world that we're in, specific to this issue. And we'll, like I said, we'll maybe touch on a few other issues as well. But specific to this issue, if you're a Christian, what does that look like? And then what are the implications in our communities if that moral structure, I won't say break down, but just is no longer exists or has a very different shape? Because now, there's no one model that you're working with.
Right.
You're working with a lot of things. It could be really confusing or difficult. Help us think through that a little bit in your context.
I think it's going to be very dislocating, particularly for people such as you and I who grew up in sort of what you might call the old America.
Right.
Now my grandparents might disagree about, things were even more different, right, when we were kids. But we still grew up in sort of Christian normative America. And in essence, this is what I mean by a soft institutionalization. I mean, a sort of Protestant Christianity was sort of part of what it meant to be an American. And if you were Catholic, you sort of understood.
God, country.
Yeah, God, country, all this stuff.
Sure.
And now, again, if you were Catholic, you would have felt a little alienated from that, maybe, coming in. And so there was this tremendous identification of sort of a certain form of Christianity with American identity. And that has sort of been severed a little bit. And I think it's going to be very hard for people who that's part of their identity as an American. To be an American, it means to be a Christian. When most Americans don't think that, that's a very uncomfortable place to be for a lot of people.
Very different place than maybe that they've been in the past.
Right.
Not that you're not welcoming.
Right.
Other faiths or those without faith or things of that nature.
Right. And so the other thing you say is it was always just assumed, I think, that the institutions of America and the culture of America sort of embodied a sort of generic Christian or generic Protestant ideal or morality. And now that's no longer the case. So you sort of assume if you're a Christian and your kids are growing up, they're in school, they're going to learn. They're going to get some moral instruction in school on what's right and what's wrong, and what's good and what's bad. Even if it's not explicitly religious, the structures of society sort of upheld and were very supportive of Christianity, right?
A piece of being a good citizen,
right.
a good student, a good kid, a good neighbor, that sort of thing.
There weren't travel team baseball games on Sunday and things of that nature.
Right.
And so now that's all gone. And so a lot of one of the things I would say is sort of Protestants never really had to have an infrastructure for sort of supporting a lot of their own faith because they relied on the institutions of society to sort of help buttress and support it.
Okay.
And now that those have been removed, it becomes much more challenging to transmit your faith and your values because you have to be much, much more intentional about it. So I think that's one implication, is there has to be greater intentionality of transmitting your values to your children. You can't just assume they're going to absorb things through osmosis or that society itself will be reinforcing of those or validating of those.
Yeah, that's a real interesting point because you're not talking about a street corner preacher or being out there trying to evangelize and that you're talking about your kids, your family. You're talking really close elements where you could rely on this idea of it takes a village, everyone's coming together, we're all surrounding and because I remember growing up where adults in the neighborhood or friends of my parents would feel real free to correct me and tell me what I needed to do right. So that's an important element, to be thoughtful and intentional.
It even affects how you do sort of evangelism. A lot of kind of evangelical outreach has been predicated on sort of lowering the barriers to faith. So we don't want to have stodgy hymns or stained glass or anything that might turn people off. We want to have a comfortable auditorium setting. We want to have really good coffee. We're going to have topical preaching. We're going to
popcorn. Our church does popcorn.
We're going to have popcorn. We're going to have laser shows and contemporary music. But the whole idea was, if we just get rid of all the all these sort of superfluous elements and sort of lower the bar, people will resonate with it. But one of the additional little twists today is that, to some extent, it will increasingly be the case to sort of just to be known as a Christian at all will incur a status penalty in society. Most people want to be high status. They want to be popular. Most of us don't want to be unpopular. And particularly
Human Dynamics 101.
Yeah, particularly in the suburban heartland of sort of evangelicalism, where people sort of are strivers. It's sort of striver class people. They want to go to college, get a good job, and they want to be respected. And so if signing on to this thing actually makes people not like you or treat you suspiciously, that's going to be very unappealing. So now you have to think about, how do you get people to sign up to something that if they sign up for it, they incur some sort of a status penalty. Now, some churches have always been like that. Some of these kind of low church fundamentalist type of places have always been like that. But I think sort of mainstream evangelicalism has always assumed that it's at least a neutral to be a member of our church. It doesn't hurt you in society. Well, maybe now it will hurt you. And that's gonna be a little twist on evangelism.
Can I ask a little bit here? As I'm listening to this, it seems that perhaps some people are looking at church or their faith as kind of like joining a club. Is it outside in, or is that part of the negative world that we're talking about, where really these are views of how I'm going to be perceived by what I do in society versus an internal personal decision of what I believe? Talk about that piece, because I'm curious how you see that.
I think there's a little bit of both. So there is a sense in which I do think some of these evangelical churches have sort of been, if not social clubs, it's a great place to belong when you have kids. It's a good, wholesome environment. There's a lot of programming. There's a lot of things. Your social life in a lot of places can revolve around a church, particularly if you live in a place where they don't have this like robust social infrastructure. So there is sort of this aspect of that. It's sort of it's sort of like buying a piece of clothing. Is this going to be in trend or off trend or whatever? But I think there is also an authentic faith element to it. Jesus himself said you got to count the cost.
Sure.
And so there is this thing, is you're signing up to something that, the Bible describes Christian life as actually being quite difficult.
Yes.
And we've sort of been like, well, that it's actually like not all that hard. Maybe you got to deny yourself. You can't sin, or at least you can't sin too much or in highly visible ways, but you're not suffering the way the early church suffered. Right. Whereas I think, it's like, if you want to sign up to this requires a commitment, and it's a big commitment. It's not just a shallow commitment. And you have to be prepared for the price of making that commitment. So I think there is sort of an authentic element here. And, another thing that I just thought of, it was somewhat controversial, this whole He Gets Us ad campaign for Jesus.
Yes.
So this Christian group created an ad campaign. They had ads on the Super Bowl, and they've been running them on social media, YouTube.
Yes.
It's going to be upwards of $1 billion could be spent on this thing. It's about introducing Jesus to people as very relatable. He gets us. And they're very well done. And what I realize about this is, when you have to run an ad campaign to tell people who Jesus is, you realize you're in a different America. And you can't, somebody like Billy Graham could have one of his crusades and just make it, talk about Jesus, present the gospel, make an altar call. People knew who Jesus, they knew what he was talking about. Yeah. They already knew this stuff, sort of.
They
basically
grew up with it. It was part of their world.
It was to say, well, now you can't even assume people really know anything at all about Jesus or about Christ. People don't really know, right, what what the faith is. Like, you got to like tell people, okay, who is this Jesus guy? And so I call that pre-evangelism. I see the He Gets Us campaign as maybe an early attempt at the kind of outreach you have to have. You can't just say, well, Jesus died for my sins. Well, who's Jesus? Yeah. You got to like kind of give them some background a little bit and all the categories and all the things. And so this is one of the ways that just from a practical perspective, outreach is going to be different, because you can't just assume people grew up knowing like who Jesus is and understanding the basic narrative of the Christian religion.
Of the Christian faith, right? Yeah. And so how does that then as well connect to moral standards, as you've talked about that, because they're connected. Your faith and kind of the life you want to live from a moral perspective. Do you have to reintroduce those as well? Is that part of being intentional with your kids and other sorts of things, rather than assuming that they're going to receive those messages along the way?
I do think so. And you could use an example of like as people who are Jewish. If you're a Jewish parent, at some point you have to explain to your kids what Christmas is and why you don't celebrate it.
Right. Yes.
For example, they're going to, what's this? So I think there's going to be more and more of that is going to be asked of sort of devout Christian families.
Right now, what is Christmas and why do you? I thought it was just a shopping holiday.
Yeah. There's things you have to teach them that are sort of the positive elements, but there's also the things that are like the negative elements. Here's what everybody else is doing, but we don't do that, and here's why we don't do that. And having things that are demarcated from society in terms of that. And it's going to be very difficult, because again, a lot of these norms like don't have premarital sex. Yeah. That would have sort of been a social norm, even if it was only honored in the breach. Nobody wanted to kind of be known for that. It was something, and so now it's like, okay, like that's like the norm. Okay. And so how do you go against that? I do think there's more intentionality around clearly delineating with like your kids and with your community, like what the expectations are. And I think if you look at Paul had to do that, right? He's in Corinthians. They're writing to Corinth, and like Corinth's doing all this stuff, and he's like, well, okay, they're doing that. And he even said, those who are outside, God judges. That's his problem, what they're doing. That's right. I'm worried about what you're doing. Yeah. And we got to clean some things up in what you're doing.
Right.
And so I think there is this element of like explaining to people like all these like practices that everybody else is doing are not things that you should be doing.
Right. So let's expand the conversation a little bit, and I don't mean to get away from faith, because I think my view is that faith, if you're a Christian, it should impact everything you do in your life. Mm-hmm. That's where you should go. And of course, we all fall short.
Right.
We all know we're going to make
right.
mistakes and that sort of thing. But let's take it to just kind of some maybe more community things about the implications of living with that in our society, and maybe what we're facing today, and maybe what our grandparents would say, the country's going down the toilet, mm-hmm. or everything's going in a wrong direction. So without making a faith judgment about society, but just looking at how the world is, or our country or our community is operating today, what are the implications of that with how we relate to each other, the implications on the family, the implications on roles of moms and dads? A lot of controversy around right. that, or men and women. What are those sorts of implications that you see? Some positive, maybe kind of breaking down barriers and letting people thrive in their life, mm-hmm. and then some that might be disruptive or harmful to society, or at least in a way that it has a consequence that maybe wasn't intended.
I would say, again, you go back to maybe the positive world even, but certainly before that, we had sort of a shared national narrative, sort of a shared religious vision. Even if it was somewhat least common denominator, Maybe it wasn't, precisely reformed in the way that the Christian Reformed Church might understand it.
Here in Grand Rapids.
But there was sort of this shared narrative, and you had this identity, and you knew what that identity meant. And certainly America was more shallowly rooted maybe than some of these European identities, but we sort of had an identity. Well, now in today's world, when all that's gone, we have to sort of construct our own identities. It's being told, you be your own authentic self. Well, that's like hard to do. You constantly got to be making choices about everything.
You don't know what that is. You don't have a standard or maybe an understanding of a standard to start with.
And I think if you look at, the happiness levels, for example, since 1970 have sort of gone down. Females have gone down a lot. Men have sort of bounced around a little bit, but are still lower than they were. And I think people have a lot of anxieties. What should I do with my life? There's a lot of this stuff. David Brooks just wrote a big piece in The Atlantic on people who are sort of reaching retirement age, but they're still trying to figure out who they are, and they're taking classes to kind of learn about that. He's like, what's going on that, you're basically my age, and you're sort of struggling with these things. So I think there's sort of the identity aspects that cause a lot of distress, and I think underlie some of the mental illness and some of the other issues that we have in our society. But there are other aspects that are sort of just objectively problematic in the sense that, for example, it's, Raj Chetty did all of his work on upward mobility. He got access to basically everybody's tax returns, and he's got proprietary data, and it's been all over the New York Times. And his finding was, what determines what neighborhoods people grow up in that determine whether you rise economically in society. And the number one predictor was the share of single mother households in the neighborhood you grew up in. If you grow up in a neighborhood, full of single moms, it could be single dads, but it's mostly single moms, then, you're going to have a much harder time rising than others. And so
possible, but it's more difficult.
You look at all the negative correlations of single parenthood, and now we have 40%, out of wedlock birth rates, things of that nature, and we just have a lot of that, and that creates a lot of little social challenges that we have. The fatherless criminal teenage boy is one of the paradigmatic examples of that. So these things have objective fallout in society, which we don't want to talk about because people don't want to feel like they're piling on single moms. It's like, my mom was a single mom, so maybe I'll talk about that. But I think we got to realize that that is, a suboptimal way to raise kids. I mean, it just is. Then we see, people turning aside from, marriage rates are falling. The number of people who never have kids are sort of falling, it's kind of falling. We're having declining birth rates. Mm-hmm. So people are sort of turning away from even reproducing themselves. And I think that will have also profound implications for our society in the future as people become, more isolated and as they age. And now you're getting old. It's great to be 30. In your 30s are almost the perfect decade to be single. You've learned a little bit about life. You've acquired a more sophisticated palate. You're making a little more money now. You can afford to eat in nice restaurants and go to Europe and all that stuff. Man, this is amazing. And all of a sudden you hit 55. It's not as amazing anymore kind of thing. When you've had the 25th steak dinner, at the local finest steakhouse, it's like the law of diminishing marginal returns sets in. And so I think that there are a lot of these issues, and we see it showing up in a number of indicators that do come back, I think, to this loss of a sort of narrative that also connected to a larger purpose, a transcendent purpose, a multi-generational purpose.
Why am I here? Why am I here?
Yes, and all of those things. And so I think these things are, I'm not going to say they're all directly caused solely by sort of the collapse of that old narrative of which faith was one component, but it's certainly related to those things.
Yeah, it's correlated. It's not caused.
Yes.
But those are, but as you say, and this is an interesting thing, happiness going down, and it's not related necessarily to money. Most of the unhappy people can be rich, and some of the happiest people are poor, because they have each other, or they have a purpose or something in life. They know who they are,
right.
and they're working towards something.
Life expectancy is in decline. That's like the ultimate metric that you can't fake. You could explain away. There's these big debates. All these economists, are things better than they used to be? Are they worse than they used to be? And there's different ways you can measure it and all that. And there's a lot of ways that things are way better than they were in the 1980s. Then you look at it, life expectancy is declining. I mean, that's that you can't fake that. You can't explain that away. And we see these enormously high deaths of despair, as they call them, people dying of drug overdoses and suicides and alcoholism and things of that nature, way up. You always see these surveys, and I'm sure there's some nuance around them, like a quarter of adult women are taking some form of psychotropic medication. So it's more likely you're more likely to kill yourself, if you're a man, in terms of dying these deaths of despair. But women are very heavily medicated as well. So it's you're ending up with, obviously there's a lot of negative things there, and you see all these studies about teenagers and their mental health issues with social media and all this stuff. And clearly there are some indicators that not all is well, even if things are going well, certain forms of technology or certain forms of GDP, which we certainly shouldn't denigrate or hope that goes away.
Right.
I rather like our air conditioning that I didn't have when I was growing up.
Right.
I'm glad that it's ubiquitous now. But there are these kind of negative things that are happening, and I think the declining life expectancy is the most alarming.
You're right. You don't fake that. It's not like anybody's answering that question differently.
People talk about American exceptionalism, and we usually mean that in a good way. That we're so much better than everybody. There's a lot of ways in which we're an outlier in a negative way. We have more people living in single-parent households as a share of our population than any country in the world. I mean, I don't think a quarter of kids right now are living in a single-parent home, and that includes the two-parent homes are people who are married but aren't actually the biological parents. Right. It's just a two-parent home. That's higher than any country in the world. You think these European countries have this relaxed attitude towards marriage and all this stuff? They're more liberal, but actually they're have more two-parent homes than we do. We're the worst in the world, worse than any developing country for which we have stats. Our life expectancy is worse at every income point than it is in the UK. Our average life expectancy is the same as some of the worst, economically distressed areas of Britain. And that's a country that's a lot poorer than we are. So we're actually doing worse than countries that are poorer. And, so on some of these metrics, we're exceptionally bad. And that's not good. It's and you see it in not all of it's related to, I'm not going to say all of it's related to religion or collapse of the shared narrative, but clearly some things are going on that aren't good.
Right. And as I kind of go back or think, and tell me if I'm wrong or where it comes from, but this whole idea of meaning and purpose. Who am I? Why am I here? And certainly faith, gives you an answer for that, gives you a framework to think about that and something to believe in. And so the absence of faith or the negative world, if you're untethered to that and you're asking yourself these questions, I would think it's hard to go through life. And I would think it's hard to relate to somebody else because you would always be thinking about who they are based on your worldview that's internal, and you want everybody else to fit your own view of the world. Is that? Am I kind of missing it, or am I hearing you right?
I think it does make things more difficult in dealing with other people. When I worked it was Anderson Consulting at the time.
Right.
Whenever anybody started, they put you through a boot camp. And 3 weeks of that boot camp was in St. Charles, Illinois, and they flew in everybody from all over the world, no matter where you were in the world when you were studying with that company. You came there, you worked together, you had the same methodology, and the point is we want a global culture in this business so that we can assemble teams of people from anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world, parachute them into a client, and they know how to work together.
Yeah.
And corporations spend a lot of time thinking about that kind of culture. Well, we used to have that kind of culture. here in America. So, for example, there's a lot of things that are sort of unwritten rules, like this idea of like, that you play by the rules.
Right.
That sort of idea of sportsmanship and fairness. Well, that is tremendously in decline today. And when you see how many people, for example, are gaming the system to try to get their kids into schools and different things like that, cheating is rampant now all over the place. And it's sort of like if you take the old, everybody out there is like playing by the rules, abiding by the norms, you're just going to get fleeced, right? And so there is this sense that so it becomes we're becoming a lower trust society, and also I just think the growing just diversity of the country demographically also lowers social trust and social cohesion, which eminent sociologists like Robert Putnam, the guy who wrote Bowling Alone and other books like that, he's documented this in like rigorous academic research. And so it becomes more difficult for people without these sort of shared ideas and shared norms. It's much more kind of every man for himself. And again, I think trust levels are in decline. And what happens what happens in low trust societies, when you're in a true low trust society, family is everything. People trust their extended family, they trust their clan, because those are the only people you can trust. So we're entering into a more low trust environment here. I wouldn't call it like Iraq low trust or someplace like that. But just as the time most people have fewer family members, and fewer things to rely on,
fewer people to rely on,
and fewer friends. And so you're now in a world where you get scammed, right and left if you're not careful, and it's like, and then then of course the people who run our country, I'm very critical of the leadership of our country, who've they've taken off all the guardrails. I mean, there used to be things that's like, hey, we know that a certain number of people are going to have problems with gambling. We shouldn't have gambling because it preys on the poor. So we're not going to have gambling. Well, now the government runs gambling.
That's right.
And our government is a partner in the gambling industry. The NFL is now like a partner in the gambling industry. Like, this is crazy to think about. Like, back when I was younger, it's like we're suspending Pete Rose for life from baseball from gambling. Now the major sports leagues are partners in the gambling enterprise, and colleges are like encouraging. It's insane. We're legalizing pot let's legalize all the drugs. Let's get rid of all these usury laws, and so we can bring in the payday loan stores and all these people. So we're becoming an effectively predatory society in which all these things that it used to be only shady characters like the mob did, the drugs, the prostitution, the sex trade, loan sharking, gambling. Those are all billion-dollar businesses today, from like the online porn industry and OnlyFans and like betting on your phone and payday loan stores. We've legitimized and institutionalized stuff that used to be only like really bad people were in that business. And it's just like crazy to me that we would do that.
Interesting. So if you go back, let me hit on a couple points that you raised. One was this idea of trust and the implications that it would have on a society. And the second one was what I always thought was the strength of America from many, that you would come around and that people came to America because they wanted to be an American. And sure, they would bring some of their traditions with them or wherever they came from. And even today, I love the immigrant story of somebody coming to America. This is the place. This is the land of opportunity. And there were these, and I'm sure there are vast numbers of people who still have that element. But you're talking about the fact that more and more people are viewing people with a lack of trust, and does that come down to the fact that there's not that view that from many I'm coming to America because of this, or I'm coming to my community because of this, or I'm engaging in my neighborhood because I know I'll be supported and I can connect with people on these values and I can trust them.
Well, today there's nothing to assimilate to. I mean, what narrative or story would you assimilate to?
Outside of the economic one, maybe.
Other than this idea that, America was the most evil country in history or something like that that's sort of been promoted in our schools. America is presented as essentially a negative identity. that you wouldn't want to associate with. And I would say if you go back, to the early 20th century, where we had mass immigration, it was probably not like a great high trust society in those environments. But we had like these waves. We brought in a wave, and then we said, okay, we're going to digest this wave for a while. Then we could take some more people in, and but we haven't. There's no idea that we need to actually create some coherent common society out of these people. And, with the Ellis Island wave of immigration, which some of my family came over from Sicily, onto Ellis Island, we had all these distinct identities. And as we were coming into the 1950s era, essentially we were a little bit, we'd sort of digested a lot of that. We were sort of redefining America in order to include these new people who come over. So prior to that, it would have been very Anglo-centric, very British. And we said, no, we're going to have a more, we're going to make room for Catholics and Jews and things, and the redefining what it meant to sort of have a country. So there was sort of an element of, America also had to make some adjustments in order to assimilate this group. But
and would that connect to the civil rights movement as well? Same.
I think that would be one of the things was sort of going on there. At the same time, there still had to be something for people to center around. There had to be something that people aspired to join. What do you aspire to join in America? If you're smart and you come from a foreign country, you talk about how oppressed you are by America, so that you can get preferential admission to Yale or something like that. So all the incentive structures are sort of messed up in our society. At present, I would say it doesn't. But I think. We'll see how it happens. I'm not going to short America, despite all of our problems. I mean, we have gone through in the past far, far worse crises and troubles than we're in right now. The Civil War was an existential crisis. Yeah. The Depression was pretty bad. World War II was pretty bad. There's a lot of things that we went through that were pretty bad, and I would say far worse than we've got today. But we have some problems. And we need to get serious about solving them.
Right, and that kind of leads. So let's kind of go. Let's talk about Grand Rapids a little bit. You're here. You're living in Indianapolis. You're from Southern Indiana, but you've written a little bit about Grand Rapids and some of the elements that have helped us grow in the past. But you also raised the question of, do we have enough of those today? And over the past few years here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and good old Midwest of the United States, we've had a level of division that I don't remember growing up here in the same way. We've had a way of working together that seems to be breaking down a little bit, that a lot of us are trying to think through how do we reestablish. That's why it's so important to hear from you as you study these things and think about these things, that we can have a better understanding of the world in which we're working and the people with whom we're working, so we can connect at a level of values and build trust and build relationships. So talk about a little bit, if you take all these ideas we've been discussing and bring it down, if you pick Grand Rapids or pick another community, just talk about maybe that more generally. What are the elements, or how should we think, and then maybe even beyond that, how should we act to build that sense of community, to build that oneness, to build something where people say, I want to be part of this, and I want what I'm part of to be successful.
Right.
I want it to win, and I'm okay that if somebody wins a little bit more than me, I'm on the team, and I know someone's going to get a little bit more notoriety because they made the play to win the game,
right.
And I was on the sidelines, but I was still on the team. How could we think about that in our neighborhoods and our communities, wherever we may be today?
America's had a long process of essentially nationalizing the country, and it really started in the after post-Civil War era with large-scale industrialization, which with big companies. But prior to the Civil War, there really weren't any big companies. There were only small companies, but all of a sudden you had steel mills and railroads and chemical companies and big food packaging companies. And we had big national companies. We had to build AT&T, the Bell system, to create that. And this created a sort of a national economy and sort of national elites. But there were still sort of regional differences and sort of regional divisions within America for a very long time after that. And there were often very localized elites and localized cultures. And we've really, in my lifetime, I think I witnessed essentially the last vestiges of, call it, local culture, local elites, local orientation get swept away in most places. In the sense that this way is like, especially when you think about like a millennial or younger, so the urban millennial in any city does not really, at the end of the day, the values that tell them that like they're a good member of society are not anything local. It's a completely national or global system. They aspire to espouse the same values as people in New York and San Francisco. And maybe they actually aspire to live in one of those places. And they just happen to end up in, Indianapolis, where I live, or in Grand Rapids, or these places. But people now take their cues from other places. And especially with industrial consolidation, there are just fewer and fewer locally based companies. And I don't have time to go through this. This is a very, very long conversation. But one of the things I'll just note was the fact that all the banks went from locally owned banks. In the 1980s, every community basically was dominated by a handful of locally owned banks, and state laws limited those bankings to only doing business in their hometown or home county. We didn't have banks like Chase, Bank of America, that spanned the country coast to coast. And so you had these local banking CEOs and
their community,
perfect alignment between professional, personal, and civic interest. They couldn't make more money unless their bank made more money, and the bank couldn't make more money unless the community grew, because they couldn't do business anywhere but their own community. Right. And so that sort of alignment existed in a lot of places. It's not true today. The people who are sort of, in a lot of corporate, even if it's a big corporation that's based locally, they have interests that span far beyond the local market. Sure. If you are the regional manager, the market president, say, of a bank here, and it's a larger bank, you think about, I want to get promoted. I'm probably going to move to another market, and I can't afford to take any risks, and I can't afford to rock the boat. And so there's a very different point of view, I think, of people who are sort of marinated in that culture. And so the opinions of out-of-towners matter a lot more today than they did in, say, the 1980s, where, yes, we all watched the national news and we, drove, from the big three cars, and there was some nationalization. And there was certainly a lot of that was in many ways the high watermark of mass consumer culture. The man on the street in, say, Louisville, Kentucky, where I grew up, was not thinking, I wonder what the people in San Francisco think about what I believe. Right. Like, San Francisco was like a weird place.
It's a world away.
That's where the hippies are. And you didn't think about it. But now the people who live in Louisville, who are certainly under the age of 50, they're all very concerned about what people in San Francisco and New York think. They're very concerned. And they take their cues from that. And it makes creating anything local very difficult. And it creates making things very, very local difficult. And you've got all these, different political splits. And so there's a lot going on there. But I think it's an inauspicious environment for any type of local solutions to emerge.
So let me take that as somebody who's born and raised in my hometown and has an affinity for my hometown, my home state. I need to understand that when I talk to younger people, and I guess I'm not one of those anymore. as you talk, I'm one of the older people now. But as I talk to younger people, their view is very different. And so if I want to engage them on local issues, I'm going to have to think very differently about what that looks like, right?
Yes. And Grand Rapids is unusual against Grand Rapids in that there are families like yours who stayed very rooted here, even though realistically you could be living anywhere. You could do anything.
And our businesses.
And your kids are here, and like grandkids are here. This is really amazing to think about. So if you go to the people who are sort of the elites of Indianapolis, all of their kids are going off to like Ivy League schools, and then they're gone.
Yeah.
They're not there anymore. So Columbus, Indiana, which is a town of about 50,000 people, just 45 minutes south of Indianapolis, is one of the great architectural destinations of the world. The American Institute of Architects rated it as the 6th best architectural city in the country. And that's because a guy named J. Irwin Miller, who was the president of Cummins Engine, a big diesel engine manufacturer, knew if he wanted to be able to attract engineers to his town. He's like, well, what could I convince them that they would move to small town Indiana? I know, we'll show them off good schools. So he basically paid the architecture fees of any architect that the city wanted to hire to design first-class buildings for their city if they picked one off his list. And he picked like Eero Saarinen and Cesar Pelli and all these like world-class, world-renowned modernist architects. So this is one of the world's foremost collections of modern architecture. And in 1968, to show you like how amazing this man was, in 1968, Esquire magazine put him on the cover. I think maybe in 67, basically saying this man should be the next president of the United States. Like, why doesn't anybody think like this anymore? A man who's like committed to his hometown, investing in his hometown, still living in Columbus, Indiana, even though he's super rich. And he was the 4th generation of his family to be there. His great-great-grandfather or whomever started like a dry goods store that turned into a bank because people started asking him to store money for them, became the biggest bank in town, built into an industrial enterprise. They actually financed Cummins Engine. They were sort of the venture capitalist, and he ended up running it. But this was 4 generations of the most prominent family in town right there. He had 5 kids. Not one of those kids. He died in 2002, I think. His kids are all alive. Not one of them lives in Columbus, Indiana. And in fact, there was a film, an indie film. It wasn't a not documentary. It was a drama set in Columbus called Columbus. It was very good. I saw it in Brooklyn, New York, when I was living in New York, and one of Miller's kids was there in the audience because he lives in New York.
Wow.
So they took the money and left. Yeah. And so that's what I mean. But like, it's not. There's nobody locally rooted. Like if you're like child of a prominent person, then you just skip town. And this guy Joel Kotkin, who's a great writer on cities. He speaks all over the country. He has this great line. He's like, whenever I speak in any city, invariably the richest guy in the room has a kid in New York or San Francisco. Yeah. And Grand Rapids has not been, that way. The fact that you still have actually children who live in this city and actually reside here like a lot of the time is very unusual. And Grand Rapids has had an unusual degree of local commitment that is sort of like a relic of a bygone day, in a sense. And my last story on this is, and I tell this in my article I wrote for City Journal about Grand Rapids. Well, I think it was 2013. A new president came into Calvin College, and he's like, "Man, we have too much debt." And it's like, "Well, we got to do something about that. So make some cuts." And he's like, "Well, I'm going to have to do a capital campaign to pay down debt." So he said, "I'm going to do a $25 million capital campaign to pay down debt." And he says, "Nobody wants to donate money to pay off debt. They want to donate money to build a gleaming new building they can put their name on." He's like, "It's going to take me 4 years to do." It ended up taking him 8 months, and not one single person who donated to that wanted their name on it. It's like all anonymous donors. They
just took care of it.
They said, "We're going to take care of this problem." And that doesn't happen in most places. That doesn't happen. The idea that like, well, we just got to all, just divvy up however much we owe. I don't know what happened, but there is a sense like we all got to like fix this problem. That's a degree of a commitment that like doesn't exist in most places. It certainly wouldn't happen in Indianapolis if Butler University ran into problems. For example, liberal arts college there. So I think those are some things Grand Rapids had, but you're not immune from the challenges that face the world.
Yeah, it's fascinating because a lot of people that I knew left Grand Rapids to go to the big cities, but they came back. There's something interesting about it. They left, but they came back. There was something here in thinking through all these elements, understanding what society's like, and especially the environment that young people are growing up in, we have to get better at telling our story,
Right.
talking about our values, expressing why people would want to be part of this successful winning team here, and then thinking through the things necessary that are the building blocks of a winning team. You got to block, you
Right.
got to tackle, you
Right.
got to throw the ball, catch the ball, run the ball, whatever the sport or the illustration may be. There's fundamental things that are going to have to be done to be successful,
Right.
and thinking through those and encouraging people to be part of those seems like something we've got to really consider.
Yes, and I don't think there's anything bad with leaving. It's great to get experience out of the
Sure,
world,
absolutely.
and then come back. You come back enriched from that. Just like it's good to go to college, but as long as you don't go to Purdue.
That's right. Oh, that's right. Yeah. I knew you had to get a shot in like that eventually. Absolutely. Aaron, this is so fun to talk about these issues, and time just flies by. I know we're kind of running up at the end of time here, and everything you've gone through, and that I read before and saw before we had this time to be together, gets me thinking, and it really gets me wondering about how do we get better? How do I get better? How do I, if you will, double down on my values or my beliefs, or question them and understand them better? And sometimes I strengthen them by questioning them.
Right.
And so maybe you can, just if you have a few thoughts or some experience that you've had that would really, that would kind of put all these things together for us, about how we could really think and apply some of these things, understanding this, this negative world we have. Many of us who are, share the Christian faith, that we're in this negative world now, and we're seeing some breakdowns, and we're in a tough spot. But I love the fact that you said you're not shorting America.
Right.
Yeah, you still believe in it.
Yeah, I'm very bullish on America over the long term. One thing I will say that's related to this three worlds hypothesis, if you're a Protestant evangelical, the model that I would be looking at is, early 20th century Catholicism, where you had large numbers of Catholics in the country, and their sort of religion was a little bit out of favor. So they had to say, if we want to inculcate Catholic values in a Protestant country, what do we need to do? And they had to build an infrastructure to do that, of Catholic schools, of Catholic organizations like the Knights of Columbus, their own sort of immigrant, onboarding, creating all this Catholic infrastructure in the United States to sustain Catholic life. And one reason, in my opinion, that the Catholic Church has done better, maybe in recent years, despite its problems, is because it had this big infrastructure that it built up. It couldn't rely on society's infrastructure. And so Protestants are going to have to do some of that too. They're going to have to build their own infrastructure and ways of, inculcating their values in the way that the Catholics had to do it through the Catholic education movement, CCD classes, all of that stuff.
But that's going to require unity. And you talked earlier about inside the evangelical movement or the Protestant. We all have our denominations, right? Everybody broke apart. So that's going to cause people or drive people to work together.
Yeah, it's going to look differently in the Protestant world, but we already see things like this with like the classical Christian schools movement, for example. That's it's sort of a decentralized. It's going to be more decentralized. It's going to be more entrepreneurial. Okay. I think in line with that sort of like Calvinist ethic. Yeah. But I think you'll see some of these things emerge.
Yeah. Aaron, I thank you for your time. AaronRenn.com. Thank you for coming, Aaron. Thank you for being here. For those who want to read more and see more about Aaron's thinking and his work, this is a fascinating conversation. We just ran out of time here. I'd love to keep you longer, but I know we got places to go and things to do. But thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, great.